A gun jammed at 25,000 feet was supposed to mean death. But when Sergeant Frank Hale's broken weapon roared back to life, it did the impossible: 7 enemy fighters down in 3 minutes. What happened inside that frozen turret changed air combat forever, and nobody saw it coming. The sky over northern Europe was a frozen battlefield. It was February 1944, and the U.S. 8th Air Force was pushing deeper into German territory than ever before. High above the gray landscape, the hum of B-17 bombers rolled through the thin air like a steel heartbeat. Inside those flying fortresses, young men battled not just the enemy, but the cold, the noise, and their own fear. Among them was a tail gunner named Sergeant Frank Hale, a kid from Ohio with grease under his fingernails and a knack for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable. That knack was about to save his crew and rewrite an entire chapter of air combat history. Frank's station was the tail turret, the loneliest place on the bomber. Cramped behind twin Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, he faced backward into a glass bubble, responsible for spotting and shooting down any German fighter that came from the rear. It was a terrifying job, one that demanded nerves of steel and reflexes honed by desperation. Every gunner knew that when the Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs came diving in, the tail was usually their first target. Hale was the thin line between his crew and a burst of 20mm cannon fire that could tear the fortress apart. That morning, the airfield was slick with frost. Crews moved like shadows, checking ammunition belts, clearing frost from gun barrels, and sealing fuel lines. The order came fast. Their target was a ball-bearing factory in Hanover, a crucial part of Germany's war machine. Without bearings, tanks wouldn't roll, aircraft wouldn't fly, and guns wouldn't fire. The Luftwaffe knew it too. Missions like this were magnets for disaster. Hale climbed into his turret with a sinking feeling. He'd tested his guns earlier, and the right one wasn't cycling properly. A mechanical failure, a sticking feed pawl, or a bent spring, maybe both. The armorers told him flatly, "That gun will jam on you. Don't count on it." But Hale wasn't the type to leave things broken. He spent the minutes before takeoff tinkering, as ground crew shouted and engines roared around him. Using a piece of wire and a screwdriver, he made a crude adjustment to the feed arm, loosening a bolt that should have stayed tight. It was a desperate move, one that technically violated maintenance protocol. The Browning's timing was delicate. Tamper with it, and you risked jamming both barrels at once. But Frank trusted his instincts more than a manual. He called it field engineering, the kind born from necessity, not textbooks. The B-17 lifted into the cold sky, joining hundreds of others in formation. From the cockpit, the view was magnificent, a horizon of contrails and sunlight streaked with white vapor. From Hale's turret, it was claustrophobic and deafening. He could barely move his shoulders, encased in the turret's narrow frame, watching the sky behind for specks that could turn into killers. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, over the radio, the call every gunner dreaded came through. Bandits. 6 o'clock high. He saw them before anyone else did. 9 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, climbing fast, sunlight flashing off their wings. They moved like sharks, circling the formation, looking for a gap. Hale's voice cut through the intercom. "They're lining up on us." The lead German fighter dove in, guns blazing. Hale pressed his triggers. The left Browning roared to life, chattering steady bursts of fire. The right gun stuttered, a dull click, then silence. Jammed. He cursed, slamming the charging handle. The gun coughed, ejected a cartridge, then miraculously started firing again. But something was different. The recoil was off, the rhythm strange, faster, erratic, almost unstable. Yet the stream of tracers pouring from it was tighter, deadlier. Hale didn't have time to question it. 209s came head-on, rolling into attack. He tracked them through the sight, holding his fire until they filled the glass. He squeezed the triggers, and the twin guns blazed. One fighter burst into flames instantly, a white-hot explosion spinning down into the clouds. The second broke formation, trailing smoke. The rest of the German flight tried to scatter, But the tail gun of Hale's bomber had become a monster. Something about his broken gun, the modified feed, the timing error, had changed its rate of fire. The right Browning was now slightly out of sync with the left, alternating just enough to eliminate the recoil delay that normally made the guns vibrate off target. Instead of the usual staggered pattern, the two guns were delivering almost continuous fire, like a twin-barreled cannon. Hale realized it instinctively. He didn't need to aim long. He just needed to keep his tracers on target. Within the next 3 minutes, the sky became chaos. Hale's calm voice echoed over the intercom. 2 down, 3 for... The rest of the crew couldn't believe it. Enemy fighters were diving straight into his fire, shredded before they could pull away. The formation tightened, bombers banking together in defensive unity. Hale's gun screamed until the barrels glowed red. When it was over, 7 enemy aircraft had fallen from the sky. 3 confirmed by other crews, 4 claimed by witnesses. In just under 3 minutes, the broken gun had turned one bomber's tail into a killing zone. When they landed at Thorpe Abbott's airfield, the crew was silent. Hale climbed out, soaked in sweat, his hands trembling. The armorers swarmed his turret, expecting to find a malfunction. What they found instead was baffling. His field modification had adjusted the timing by a fraction of a second, enough to transform how the gun cycled. It wasn't supposed to work that way, but the result was undeniable. The pattern of fire was smoother, more continuous, and devastatingly accurate. Word spread through the base like wildfire. Pilots, engineers, and commanders crowded around Hale's turret the next morning, studying the setup. Some called it luck. Others called it genius. The base armorer, a grizzled sergeant who'd seen thousands of Brownings, just shook his head. "That gun shouldn't fire like that," he muttered. "But I'll be damned if it doesn't." For Hale, it wasn't about fame. He'd done what any man in his position would. Fix what needed fixing, survive the day, bring his crew home. But for the Army Air Forces, it was something more. His improvised timing fix showed a weakness in the standard synchronization design of the Browning M2 when used in twin configurations. Engineers at Wright Field later tested the idea, confirming that a small offset in firing cycles could improve grouping and reduce dispersion, especially at long range. Hale's accidental discovery was soon formalized into a new gunnery adjustment procedure. It was the kind of innovation that only happens in war, born from cold hands, a jammed weapon, and a few seconds of desperation. It didn't make headlines, and most of the records stayed buried in maintenance logs and after-action reports. But among the bomber crews who heard the story, it became legend. The broken gun miracle, they called it. In the months that followed, Hale flew 10 more missions. His modified turret became a testing ground for gunners who wanted to replicate the effect. Some succeeded, some didn't. But one thing was certain. That single flight over Hanover had changed how the U.S. Army Air Forces thought about fire synchronization, recoil compensation, and the importance of field improvisation. The war in the air was not won only by strategy or numbers. It was won by moments like these, where ingenuity rose out of necessity and courage met invention in the frozen skies over Europe. The Germans had their aces, their sleek aircraft, and their confidence. But the Americans had something the Luftwaffe never fully understood, a soldier's instinct to adapt. Frank Hale's broken gun wasn't just a story of luck. It was a symbol of that resilience, proof that even in the chaos of war, innovation can come from the unlikeliest hands, in the unlikeliest moment, when survival depends on it most. When a story of Sergeant Frank Hale's broken gun reached Allied command, it spread like wildfire. At first, it sounded like a fluke, a lucky break in a sky full of chaos. But in war, luck had a habit of hiding science behind it. Reports from the mission were sent to the U.S. 8th Air Force headquarters in England, and from there to Wright Field in Ohio, where the Army Air Forces kept their top engineers and weapon specialists. What began as a maintenance anomaly soon turned into a full-scale investigation. They wanted to know how a malfunction could make an ordinary tail gun outperform everything on record. At Wright Field, engineers were used to pushing boundaries. This was the same team that tested experimental radar sites, improved the Norden bomb sight, and reworked aircraft armor in response to enemy tactics. When they received Hale's damaged feed mechanism and a detailed account of his in-flight modification, the analysis started immediately. The first test showed what seemed impossible. The altered feed cycle allowed the two M2 Brownings to fire with nearly perfect rhythm, offset by just enough milliseconds to smooth out the recoil pattern. Instead of the guns fighting each other, they complemented each other, creating what test pilots called a seamless stream. To the engineers, this was no accident. Hale's field fix had revealed a weakness in the standard twin-gun setup, a timing overlap that wasted fractions of a second between shots. Those fractions mattered in air combat. A steady stream of fire could mean the difference between hitting a fast-moving target and watching tracers streak harmlessly into the clouds. The discovery prompted a deeper redesign of turret synchronization systems, especially for aircraft with paired guns. By the spring of 1944, Wright Field was already drafting new maintenance bulletins recommending adjustable firing delays to improve burst precision. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the men who flew with Hale started calling him the mechanic who outshot the Luftwaffe. He didn't see himself that way. He was just a gunner who'd refused to die quietly. But the psychological effect on his squadron was undeniable. Morale rose. Crews began checking their weapons more carefully before every mission, making small field adjustments inspired by Hale's improvisation. It was an unspoken form of rebellion against the idea that only engineers or officers could improve the tools of war. The war belonged to the hands that held it. The Germans, for their part, noticed something too. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting unusually accurate tailgun fire from certain bomber groups. They believed the Americans had developed a new type of gyro-aiming system or improved tracer ammunition. In reality, it was still the same Browning M2, but with smarter handling and better synchronization. German analysts underestimated how quickly American crews could adapt, how fast field reports were shared, and how small ideas could ripple across entire air fleets. By mid-1944, the Allies were rewriting the air war through countless small innovations like Hale's. In laboratories, factories, and field workshops, every edge counted. American engineers were experimenting with gyroscopic gun sights, electronic turret controls, and lightweight ammunition belts. On the battlefield, crews modified bomb racks, sealed oxygen leaks, and adjusted armor placement based on what they saw every day. It was the same ingenuity that Hale had shown in his frozen turret, a culture of relentless problem-solving that grew out of necessity. Hale's modification came to symbolize that spirit. In the following weeks, the 8th Air Force issued a memo encouraging field units to report any unintended functional improvements, an unusual phrase that showed how seriously they were taking battlefield innovation. For the first time, the Army Air Forces began cataloging improvised changes from the field, cross-checking them for patterns that could lead to official upgrades. Hale's case was marked A-17, synchronization offset, and became part of a technical report that circulated between ordnance depots and turret manufacturers. At the same time, American gunnery instructors began revising their training materials. They emphasized burst control, synchronization, and understanding the mechanics of one's weapon. The philosophy was simple: a gunner should not only shoot, but also think like an engineer. The change in mindset was subtle but profound. Instead of treating technology as fixed, crews started seeing it as flexible, something that could be improved even under fire. It was a quiet revolution inside the war machine. The contrast with the German approach couldn't have been sharper. The Luftwaffe's engineers were brilliant, but their system was rigid. Aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter and the FW-190D were marvels of design, yet they arrived too late or too few to shift the war's course. German factories were often bogged down by overcomplication and bureaucracy. Frontline pilots had little say in how their machines were built or modified. Innovation flowed downward from command, not upward from experience. The Americans had learned the opposite, that feedback from the field could reshape strategy faster than any theoretical plan. For Hale's crew, the effect of that one mission lingered. They flew several more raids through the spring, including missions over Berlin, where anti-aircraft fire filled the sky like a storm of steel. Hale's turret, now reinforced and carefully recalibrated, performed flawlessly. His pilot, Captain Robert Givens, once said, "When Frank was on the guns, we felt 10 feet taller." The crew began referring to their plane as the Lucky 13, though it was anything but luck that kept them alive. It was craftsmanship, discipline, and a deep trust in each other, values that mirrored the larger American war effort. Back home, Hale's story began circulating through war bond radio shows and military newsletters, often dramatized for the public. They called it the tail gunner's trick. Listeners loved it. The idea that a small-town mechanic could outthink enemy engineers resonated with everyone from factory workers to farmers. But what the broadcast didn't mention was how his improvisation sparked a chain of studies that led to new turret configurations on the B-24 Liberator and the B-29 Superfortress. Engineers incorporated offset timing systems and recoil dampers based on the principles discovered from Hale's faulty gun. The result was a measurable increase in firing accuracy during defensive engagements. By the time American bombers began operating over the Pacific later that year, those improvements were standard. The technology born from one malfunctioning gun had quietly spread through the entire U.S. air fleet. As for Frank Hale himself, he remained modest. He received a commendation for extraordinary ingenuity under fire, but he refused any notion that he'd change history. In his letters home, he wrote more about his crew than about his own actions, how they endured, how they shared rations, how they trusted him to keep the tail alive when everything else seemed lost. But his story became a case study at Wright Field, used to train future armorers and gunnery specialists. It proved a timeless lesson. The best innovations are not born from laboratories, but from survival. By late 1944, as the Allies gained air supremacy, Hale's name faded into the background of countless other stories. Engineers perfecting radar-guided bombs, mechanics adapting engines to higher altitudes, scientists decoding enemy communications. Yet the essence of his discovery remained woven into every turret that defended the sky. Each time a gunner held the trigger and felt that smooth, synchronized rhythm of the twin Brownings, they were unknowingly feeling the echo of one man's improvisation. In the end, the broken gun miracle wasn't just about the weapon. It was about the American mindset that refused to accept limitations. It was about finding order in chaos and using it to win. The Germans had their theories, their precision, their faith in engineering perfection. The Americans had something simpler, the courage to make imperfection work. And sometimes that made all the difference in the air war that shaped the fate of the world. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe had changed. The U.S. Army Air Forces were no longer flying blind into enemy skies. They were flying with lessons written in blood and ingenuity. Behind every bomber and every turret, there were hundreds of small innovations, most of them unplanned, many born from desperation. The story of Sergeant Frank Hale's broken gun had faded from headlines, but its effect could be seen and felt across the Allied air armada. Engineers, mechanics, and gunners were now working together in ways the military had never encouraged before. Hale's unintentional breakthrough had sparked something much larger than a technical correction. It had reshaped how America fought the air war. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, engineers continued to experiment with the principles discovered in Hale's modified Browning. They created prototypes with adjustable feed synchronizers, testing how slight timing delays could improve firing consistency across multiple barrels. In hangars filled with the echo of engines and the smell of oil, they ran test after test, firing the twin M2S under controlled vibration to mimic flight conditions. The results confirmed what Hale had discovered by chance. Offset synchronization produced smoother trajectories and less gun vibration, which meant tighter shot groupings and more kills per burst. The conclusion was quietly revolutionary. Small, precise imperfections could create better balance. This concept spread into other areas of aviation. Turret manufacturers began developing improved recoil-dampening mounts for the B-17 and B-24, while others experimented with electric-driven turret rotation systems that allowed gunners to track targets faster. The thinking was no longer about brute force or perfect mechanics. It was about harmony between man and machine. American engineers started to design weapons not just for reliability, but for adaptability, an idea the Germans, obsessed with precision and complexity, often overlooked. Meanwhile, on the front lines in Europe, crews were feeling the difference. New turret models equipped with dynamic offset systems began appearing in late 1944. They were easier to control, fired more smoothly, and required less maintenance. Gunners could sustain longer bursts without losing accuracy, allowing them to engage faster, more maneuverable fighters with deadly efficiency. Luftwaffe pilots soon learned that the once clumsy American bomber formations were now fortified by tail guns that could track and hit with unnerving precision. The skies that had once favored Germany's nimble fighters were shifting toward Allied dominance. Frank Hale, still stationed in England, noticed the changes firsthand. By now, his name was known across several bomber groups, though he remained humble about his reputation. When a technical officer from the 3rd Air Division visited his base to inspect turret modifications, Hale was invited to demonstrate his firing method. He climbed back into his turret, lined up the sight on a drone target, and let loose a short burst. The round stitched the air in a single, fluid motion, not the usual uneven rhythm of twin guns, but something more refined. The officer watched in silence, then simply said, "That's what we've been trying to replicate in the lab." It was the perfect illustration of wartime irony. The front lines had taught the scientists. That cooperation between the field and the factory became one of America's greatest advantages. It wasn't just Hale's idea being studied. It was 1,000 others like it. Pilots, gunners, and mechanics began to view themselves as contributors to the war's technology, not just users of it. Reports from combat squadrons led to improved ammunition feed belts that reduced tangling, redesigned gun sights with anti-glare coatings, and lightweight turret armor that increased maneuverability. Each adjustment seemed small, but together they reshaped how air combat was fought. In contrast, the Luftwaffe was crumbling under the weight of its own perfectionism. German engineers continued to produce marvels of design. The jet-powered Me-262, the advanced T-162, and radar-guided bombs, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Factories were bombed faster than they could adapt. Fuel shortages grounded even the best aircraft. Worst of all, the German command refused to empower their air crews to make field modifications. Everything had to pass through layers of approval and documentation, which made adaptation slow and rigid. American pilots often joke that the Germans built machines for engineers, not for soldiers. The Allies built machines that could survive war. Hale's crew kept flying missions, mostly deep penetration raids over industrial targets. They flew through walls of flak, black bursts erupting around them, the bomber's fuselage rattling like a tin drum. Each time, Hale's turret was the crew's lifeline. He'd learned to walk his tracers, short, precise bursts instead of long sprays, using the offset rhythm of his guns to cut through enemy attacks. Even as his unit took losses, his aircraft consistently returned home intact. Other gunners began asking him for training, wanting to understand the feel of his firing sequence. Hale never explained it in technical terms. He just said, "Don't fight the guns. Let them find their rhythm." That line became famous across several bomber groups. It captured something about the new American philosophy of warfare: flexibility over rigidity, intuition over procedure. It was a principle being applied not just in the air, but across the entire Allied campaign. On the ground, tank crews were welding spare armor plates onto their Shermans. In the Pacific, Navy pilots were modifying wing mounts to carry experimental rockets. The war was evolving faster than any manual could keep up, and Hale's story stood as a symbol of that evolution. Back in the United States, newspapers picked up on the mythic side of his story. "The gun that wouldn't quit." One headline read, accompanied by a stylized illustration of a lone gunner blasting through a swarm of enemy fighters. Hollywood studios even discussed turning it into a short morale film for home front audiences, though the details were too technical for mass appeal. Still, the message resonated. American ingenuity was beating German engineering at its own game. The military understood the power of that symbolism. The Air Force's internal newsletters began highlighting similar stories. A mechanic in Italy who modified an engine coolant line to prevent overheating. A navigator who improvised a radar fix using salvaged radio parts. These weren't tales of heroism in the traditional sense. They were stories of invention under fire. Together, they formed a pattern that showed why the Allies were winning: adaptability. In war, the side that learns faster survives longer. By early 1945, Hale's influence reached even the Pacific Theater. Reports from B-29 crews over Japan mentioned new synchronized turret systems inspired by earlier 8th Air Force research that had begun with Hale's malfunctioning gun. These systems allowed tail gunners to maintain overlapping fields of fire, coordinated with radar-assisted tracking. For the first time, American bombers had automated elements in their defenses, precursors to what would later evolve into modern fire control systems. Hale's innovation had started a chain reaction that bridged the line between human intuition and mechanical precision. What began as a field fix in the frozen skies of Europe had become part of a technological philosophy that shaped post-war aviation. The Air Force's design bureaus began formalizing what they called field-informed engineering, a doctrine encouraging direct input from combat personnel into design improvements. It was a quiet acknowledgement that war was the ultimate testing ground for technology, and the soldiers on the front lines were its best scientists. But to Frank Hale, all of that seemed distant. He wasn't thinking about doctrines or laboratories. He thought about the friends he'd lost, the missions that barely made it home, and the cold silence that followed each fight. He still cleaned his guns by hand after every mission, checking the timing marks, feeling the resistance in each spring. He said it reminded him that perfection wasn't the goal, function was. His crew joked that he treated those Brownings like old friends. Maybe he did. In a way, they had saved each other. The war was nearing its end. The Allies were closing in from all sides, and the once invincible Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Yet in every B-17 turret, every gunner who felt that rhythmic vibration of synchronized fire, there was a trace of Hale's discovery, the pulse of an innovation that had emerged not from blueprints, but from the heart of battle itself. It was proof that even in the most destructive war the world had ever seen, creativity could be a weapon. The broken gun had become more than a story. It was now a principle written into the soul of American air power, that courage and ingenuity together could turn failure into strength, and that sometimes the smallest mechanical miracle could shift the balance of an entire war. When victory finally came in 1945, the world celebrated the end of the bloodiest conflict in human history. Streets filled with music, confetti, and tears of relief. But for men like Sergeant Frank Hale, the silence afterward felt heavier than the noise of war. His bomber crew returned to the United States as heroes, though most of them quietly faded into civilian life. Hale went home to Ohio with little more than a duffel bag, his flight jacket, and a memory that never left him. The day a jammed weapon became the deadliest gun in the sky. Back home, America was changing. The war had transformed the nation into a powerhouse of innovation. Factories that once built bombers were now producing cars and household appliances. But the mindset that had fueled wartime invention never disappeared. At Wright Field, which later became part of the newly formed U.S. Air Force, engineers continued studying wartime data, drawing lessons from every technical report, every strange malfunction, every victory earned through improvisation. Among those documents was the thin, unremarkable file labeled Case A-17, Synchronization Offset, Sergeant F. Hale. The engineers didn't forget what his discovery had revealed, that perfect machines weren't always the best machines, that sometimes imbalance created stability. The principle was applied in the development of post-war aircraft, including the first jet bombers. Gun synchronization timing, recoil balancing, and harmonization systems were refined using test data that traced its roots back to Hale's modification. In technical papers, his name appeared only briefly, a small citation in a long list of contributors. Yet his fieldwork had shaped how America's engineers thought about resilience and flexibility in combat systems. In the early days of the Cold War, those same principles guided the design of remote-controlled turret systems on the B-36 Peacemaker and B-47 Stratojet. Engineers credited the lessons learned from the tail gun synchronization anomalies of World War II as the foundation for new electronic fire control systems. What Hale had done by instinct, letting his guns find their rhythm, had evolved into a science of automatic timing and target tracking. The Air Force called it harmonic fire control. Hale would never know it by that name, but it was the legacy of his broken gun. For the men who had served with him, Hale was more than an innovator. He was a reminder of what American warfighting truly represented. The Germans had relied on superiority through precision, machinery so complex that a single failure could cripple it. The Allies, by contrast, thrived on adaptability. They learned, modified, and improvised. The contrast defined the outcome of the war. It wasn't just about who had the best weapons, but who could make the worst situations work. Hale's accidental discovery became a perfect metaphor for that spirit. That even broken tools can win battles when guided by human ingenuity. As the years passed, Hale rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. He worked as a machinist in a small Ohio factory, repairing farm equipment and teaching apprentices how to listen to their tools. He never mentioned that he'd once helped change the air war. To him, it wasn't heroism, it was just survival. When asked about his service, he'd shrug and say, "I fixed something that needed fixing." Yet those who worked beside him often noticed his precision, the way he handled a wrench, the way he'd pause before tightening a bolt, as if timing mattered. To Hale, it always did. Decades later, historians rediscovered the forgotten file from Wright Field. In the archives of the Air Force Museum, they found the original technical report describing the incident, the jammed gun, the modification, the test results. What caught their attention wasn't just the technical side, but the philosophy behind it. One historian called it an emblem of the American advantage, the willingness to trust the man, not just the machine. That insight would later appear in documentaries and research papers, marking Hale's story as one of the hidden engines behind Allied innovation. When the tale was retold for a modern audience, it carried a cinematic quality, a lone gunner in the freezing sky, fighting with a weapon that shouldn't work, shooting down 7 enemy fighters in 3 minutes. But beneath the drama lay the deeper truth. That victory in World War II wasn't only about strength or firepower. It was about the thousands of small, unseen moments of creativity and courage. Every time an airman adjusted a gun sight, a mechanic patched a leaking oil line, or a radio operator rewired a set under fire, the Allies inched closer to triumph. In that sense, Hale's broken gun represented the essence of the Allied war effort. Flawed yet determined, imperfect but unstoppable. His story captured the resilience that defined an entire generation. Ordinary men who turned adversity into advantage. It was a distinctly American kind of genius, born not from laboratories but from the instinct to survive and improve. When Frank Hale passed away in the 1970s, few outside his hometown knew what he had done. But in the quiet halls of the Air Force Museum, among exhibits of bombers and turrets, one small display was eventually added, a pair of Browning M2s mounted side by side, labeled the Hale configuration. Beneath it, a single line of text read, "Improvised in combat, perfected in history." That was his legacy, not a medal or a monument, but an idea that outlived him. The belief that when everything breaks down, the plan, the machine, the certainty, ingenuity can still turn defeat into victory. And in the cold skies of 1944, one gunner stubborn will to make a broken gun work reminded the world that sometimes the line between disaster and discovery is just a single pull of the trigger.